This is our panel on data and your business, what you need to know. And we have a stellar lineup. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and the panelists. But first, I thought it'd be really awesome to know about you guys because that would help us frame our discussion. So I was wondering if you guys would mind, if this wouldn't violate your privacy, to share. How many of you are in high-tech startups? Half? Okay. Medium tech? Is that what the, like... Consultants, okay. And then are there lawyers here? Communications people? Okay. Good. Okay, well. FTC regulators. Any regulators, law, undercover cops, anything? Okay. As long as we're going there. Where's the NSA? Okay, great. So we're gonna keep our conversation as light as possible and digestible. But I'm gonna make sure to leave time for questions. So I want to make sure you guys get a chance to ask these guys all your questions. So first, I want to tell you about me. Who am I? Why am I here? I'm Julia Angwin. I'm a journalist. I am at ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative news company. And I have been writing about privacy and technology issues for 4 years. I just published a book called Dragnet Nation, which is basically about what is the consequences. How do you live in a world of indiscriminate surveillance where your data is being collected, whether or not you're a suspect of a crime, whether or not you have a relationship with the company that's collecting the data. And in the course of writing that book, I tried a whole bunch of experiments to protect my privacy, most of which were sadly unsuccessful. Although I like to say it was like 50% successful, which is probably an optimistic view of it. So I am privileged to be here with a great lineup of people. Robert Gibbons is an associate at Cooley. He's a lawyer, but he advises startups on privacy issues, but he's a long history as an engineer and developer, and so he works closely with technology teams to understand their issues and help them build products that won't surprise and disappoint customers. His company represents all the big names, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn. To his right is Brian. Brian is general counsel of Foursquare. He's been there 4 years, basically considers himself a quasi-founder because he was there advising them on the formation. He's always been representing startups. In his previous life at a law firm, he was representing Etsy, Tumblr, and he is committed to helping companies keep consumer trust. And then at the far right, we have Andy. Andy is the director of transparency at Ghostery. If you don't know Ghostery, it's a browser plugin that lets you see who's tracking you. It has a little picture of a ghost. It's very cute. Andy's been there for 5 years, and before that, he worked in the ad industry at Right Media, so he knows of whom he tracks. So I asked them all to just start with a few pieces of advice. Like, what would they say to somebody who came to them and said, what do I need to know to make sure I don't run afoul of the law or of actually just sort of social norms in terms of building technology that is privacy friendly? So I'm going to start with Robert.
Sure. So hi. Something that comes up a lot in my work, I work with primarily high-tech companies, so that was that question on how many kind of tech-oriented companies do we have here. But I think it comes up across the board is there is somewhat of a conflict in privacy between going fast and growing very fast and having procedures in place and having kind of engineering know-how in place that builds a foundation that supports privacy. And you see it in companies large, certainly, like target breaches is kind of on everyone's mind, but even downstream, there's kind of much smaller breaches that happen. And so something that I often kind of counsel startups on is the need to, everyone has usually a privacy policy up front because it states to the world, how we're going to use your data. It's very rare, though, to see kind of an internal backup to that on, okay, how do we actually deal with, if we violated or there's been a breach? To think that through ahead of time, it's somewhat of a thought exercise, kind of like how startups need to write business plans, even though that's usually not the reality of how it ultimately shapes up. But there's something that, in the investment community that believes that going through that exercise is somehow valuable. And I think on the privacy side, thinking through how are we going to respond if something happens. It kind of leads you to do a little bit more planning and at least identify the people. And I think it's mitigation. On my work on the kind of valuing company side, it certainly comes up a lot. Privacy now, kind of what your infrastructure is, have you thought about it? How are you using data that you collect from consumers? And particularly, have you, is the value that you're providing equivalent to kind of the information you're extracting from people, right? So there's that kind of bargain where what a company is giving, say, away for free, should be roughly equivalent to the type of information they seek to extract from their users. It's kind of the broad strokes of what I see a lot.
So I want to talk a little bit about the perspective of a company. Of a company, developing a product. What the world used to be, and when I say used to be, it was only 3, 4, 5 years ago, was companies, new startups would just go out and create something, and then at the end they would call up the lawyer, if they even called up a lawyer, and said, hey, can you slap a privacy policy on this? And in most cases, it was an off-the-shelf privacy policy. I recall early on in my career actually creating a form, and that form did not change very much across anybody, because that was just what everybody did. That's changed. Buzzwords that go out now in the privacy community is this concept of privacy by design, which is that from the beginning, you need to be thinking of privacy, and not necessarily from a legal standpoint. The legal standpoint is probably what you would say the scariest standpoint. But in reality, for a startup business, what you need to be worried about more is the PR point of view. Is your consumers, do they actually trust what you're doing? If you screw up, yes, you'll get the legal issues, but legal, you can just throw a little bit of money at it. If you screw up and freak out and your customers, you're toast. So with the privacy by design, when you come in, you need to be thinking, hey, what data am I collecting? Do I really need that data? How is that data going to be used by me? How am I going to share that data? So that concept. And then how am I going to let the users know? This gets to the basic privacy policy, but these days, privacy policies are not enough. Other buzzwords you hear in this area is transparency. You'll talk about transparency more, but notice and choice and control. How do you notify users? Privacy policies, those are more for you to protect yourself if somebody comes to sue you, but your users really are going to have a tough time reading them. So, just-in-time notifications is this concept of letting people know right in the app or the service or the web page or wherever what you're doing. And in most cases, if you tell the user, I'm going to do this so you can get this other thing, your users say, great, that's perfect. That takes away the creepiness of it. But it's something you need to think of from the beginning. And then you also do need to think about not only giving them notice, but giving them the choices to do things, giving them settings, giving them things. Facebook was notorious at the beginning, and maybe even still, at not providing settings or giving settings and then taking them away. So Facebook a few years ago was subject to an FTC investigation where they were subject to a consent decree, which means they were found guilty by the FTC, which was based on they had provided users with a bunch of privacy settings, and then they decided did not want the users to have that much control, and so they took them away. You don't do that. So again, while the legal stuff will come up and get you, in the U.S., they're really, for the most part, unless you're dealing with protected health information, children's data, the only law you're really under is what's referred to as Section 5 of the Consumer Protection Act, which is unlawful, deceitful practices against users. So the thing I try to tell to my team is, think about how your users are going to think about this. In fact, with all of my product managers, when they come to a new feature, I make them draft an FAQ, which in plain English that they would theoretically share with their grandmother. And if their grandmother would be creeped out, that feature doesn't go. So yeah.
I like the word creepy.
Creepy.
It's kind of a good paradigm for thinking of this.
Yeah, so it's gratifying to hear a lot of this, right? Because this echoes a lot of what we hear from consumers, right? So in many ways, I'm going to do what you should never do on a panel and say, like, I agree with everything that's been said so far. The concept of disclosure not being transparency and disclosure being different things, I think, is something that companies are really just beginning to come around to, right? And privacy policies as legal disclosures, or even worse as like legal protective documents, you're incentivized as a company to like withhold as many rights as you can in those documents. So often, in order to avoid attentions from attorneys general and stuff like that, you've got in there allowances for stuff that you don't actually plan on doing, or you don't do in any sort of practically significant way, right? So this concept of like a transparency statement or like a data use statement, that's really sort of coming around. Companies are coming around to this idea to say, we'll have this legal document that lays down in terms of how we comply with laws. And then we'll have a statement that people can read that says what we're actually doing, which I think that's an enormous step. But I'd like to take it one step further and say that that kind of transparency, that kind of disclosure has to be transactional, right? So just a link somewhere on your website that says, in the course of all the stuff you do with our product, this is how we collect data. That's, again, that becomes less helpful. Even our tool, we list all the different companies that are collecting information, but it's all company based, right? We got to give you the name of something, right? So we give you the name of all these companies, and we hear from our users all the time, like, I don't know who Triggit is. Like, I don't know what this means. What are they doing? Like, how is this affecting my data management? How is this affecting what I'm looking at on this web browser right now? So even users who are so dedicated to this concept of transparency and data management that they've taken the time to install our tool and then give us feedback. So, all 9 of those people, this idea that, like, I want to know what is going on, right? And so that idea of transactional transparency and information that's relevant right then, I think, is important in the data world. And I don't think it's the pushback that you normally get from this is that it's too difficult to make someone understand what it is that you're doing, right? It's too difficult to express in terms that a layperson can understand. But I always just point to the nutrition label on food, right? Like, I don't know what magnesium does for me. I don't know. I think I'm supposed to get it. So generally, I just look at a nutrition label, and if those numbers are high down there by the vitamins, like, that's good, right? Like, I don't parse all of that individual information down to something that's actually relevant to me, right? But if I did know, or if I had a particular need for those vitamins, I would have it, right? I'd have that information there. And then further, we've created a culture as users of that information where I'm responsible for it, right? Like, you can eat whatever you want, but you can't pretend Fruit Loops is a healthy breakfast. It's right there on the label, right? You're no longer allowed to be fooled by the complete breakfast thing, right? Like, you should know. And so I think it's a double-sided thing where if corporations can continue to move toward that, here's actually what we're doing, it's relevant and it's transactional and it all makes sense. We'll see user culture also move to the fact where it's like, this shouldn't be something that's really, really difficult to understand, that we are responsible for understanding it.
Right. I mean, and that's something which is probably apparent to everybody here, is that, this is the basis of capitalism right now, or consumerism, is that companies provide their services for free in exchange for some information so that they can monetize their product in some way. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. What's the bad thing is when the monetization is happening in a way that you didn't understand, or
it's still a mystery to people, right? Like, I've been calling it the Silicon Rule. Like, Julie and I have been stating this over and over again for years, right? But it's, if the product is free, then you are the product. Right? That's it. That's the rule. If you didn't pay for that thing, and in many cases, even if you did pay for that thing, it's continuing to be monetized by the way that you use it, by information about you and how you're using it, right? But
I think that the thing I want to push back, I'm going to be the only one actually arguing with you guys, I realize, so I'm going to be the controversial one here, but I would just want to push back on a few of those thoughts. So one thing is that this transaction that you're talking about, the free service, and then you pay with your data, is definitely the model we're at right now. But I want to push back on the idea that people could really effectively value their data, right? I can't really participate in that exchange, because what I don't know is Facebook just announced yesterday, right, we're going to follow all your browsing around the web, even if you don't click on the like button, which they were technically doing before, but now they say they're going to operationalize.
Yeah, the keyword there is announced.
Correct. Announced.
Did you see that they provided you a user setting which happened to be the the standard NAA opt-out. I was like,
Oh,
wow,
yeah.
thank you.
Don't even get me started. So anyways, so let's say, so Facebook wants to track me around the web as I browse by my name, which by the way is like, it's like that's a new level of tracking, right? Because it's now Julia going around the web. It's not just cookie number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And how do I know whether I'm getting a fair deal for that, right? Because right now, my browsing history might be what I consider completely innocuous, and I'm sort of willing to share it for the Facebook services. And by the way, of course, that's totally not true for me. I'm so not on Facebook. But like theoretically, if I wasn't a paranoid privacy person, that might be true. But the thing is, like, I don't know whether in 5 years they change their privacy policy and they're like, actually, we're going to sell your browsing histories to employers so they can do background checks. And then all of a sudden, like, my value of my data totally changes in my mind, right? Wait, okay, it's totally fine that Facebook knows that all I do all day at work is shop for shoes, but like, sort of not cool for my boss to know that. So I think we have a hard time pricing our data. And actually, I'll take it one step further, which is in history, humans have just basically failed to be able to adequately price their data in the labor market, right? So before there were labor laws, children worked all day, all night, right? There were people, old people, young people, everybody worked, fell over dead at their jobs, right? And there was a long and sustained argument, which was upheld by the Supreme Court for many years, that that was appropriate. They had the choice of selling their labor into the market for those many hours and that low wages, and so that's capitalism. And I think we have to just recognize that sometimes capitalism needs reining in. And I wonder if data is also one of those things that we can't adequately price. So I want to throw that out to you guys.
Well, so there's been a study, well, many studies about this, about how individuals price their data. And I think it came out of Carnegie Mellon, where they asked people to whether or not they were comfortable providing a certain types of information, like would you provide your name, your email address, your phone number, your social security number, all this type of information, and they got this resounding no, we wouldn't provide it for anything. It's too creepy, etc. And then at the end, I said, "Oh, okay. Hey, if you want to come up and get a brownie, just fill out a card." and it was I don't think it was social security number, but it was most of the data points, and people freely for a brownie threw down their data. So yes, I don't know. Maybe a brownie is worth that much data.
Well, that's my point. Is like we're clearly willing to sell our data for a price of a brownie, if not less. And
so it's just it goes exactly to your point that I don't think us as consumers do understand what value there is. But there's also the concern that some users just don't care.
Well, it's paradoxical, right? Yeah. Because the truth is that for most of the time online, the actual money that's being exchanged for your data is way less than a brownie's worth, right? It's way less. It really is. And those data sets are valuable. It's this weird sort of paradoxical thing because the data sets are valuable because they're enormous aggregate sets of individual information, right? But the real value for a business only comes in the giant aggregate set of it. The value for us in principle is our individual information. And so that butts heads because there's been a fair amount of attention to some idea of like a data locker or something like that where you really are involved in your transaction for your data, but then you immediately get introduced to the ad tech world where you're talking about fractions of a penny per 1,000 times your data's being used. And it's like nobody... Like, I wouldn't fill out that form for 2 cents a month. Like, I just won't do it. I'm not going to maintain that. I'm not going to log in. I'm not going to... I sold a couple of T-shirts on Zazzle 3 years ago, and I get an email like once every 6 months to tell me I've got like 27 cents worth of profit. I don't do anything with it, right? It's like that's what becomes problematic when you start talking about actually injecting yourself into that transaction. Is those are tiny, tiny, tiny transactions that the business of it is not compelling as an individual business. Right. The principle of it is compelling on an individual level.
So we basically have this situation, which we just described, which is that the free market situation here is that your data is worth less than a brownie, and it might lose you your job in the future, right? So it's like incredibly not valuable and incredibly valuable at the same time. So I want to say, let's put aside the market because it's not working in this situation. I would say this is a market where market solutions, I want to put it aside and let's talk about legal for a second. And then we will open it up. I'm sure you guys want to go back to the market. That's fine. But let's talk about legal because here's another thing we're talking about, which is you mentioned this fine that Facebook got. Or actually, you mentioned the consent decree. Well, I would just like to point out there was no fine. So the
Because the FCC
regulators
does not have the right.
as long as we're real politic about this, there's actually no penalty for abusing people's data. Let's just be clear about that. The FTC has no
20 years of audit
ability.
requirements are really expensive.
It's expensive to Facebook, but not that expensive.
No, to
Right?
Facebook, it's not expensive. To Snapchat, who just got one, it's expensive.
For Snapchat, it might be, yes. They also got an FTC consent decree. But the truth is nobody had to pay money. The biggest fine was Google, $22.5 million, which is 5 hours of revenue. And in that particular case, I don't know if you guys remember, but Google was being incredibly deceptive. I mean, they had inserted code into ads that basically tricked your browser into changing its privacy settings to allow them to drop a cookie when you were blocking cookies. That's pretty egregious, right? That's a very deliberate.
But that wasn't evil, though.
Yes, it was definitely not evil. But I'm just saying, like, that's how far you have to go to get a $22.5 million fine, and that's the highest we've ever seen. And so for small companies, actually, you're right, that there is a real cost to it. For big companies, there's not, and that's what actually my point is. My point is that unfortunately, with this legal landscape, the incentives are to act badly. Because if everyone's in a race for data, to monetize data, then the truth is the person who grabs the most monetizes the most, and since there's really no true penalty, like the bad actors win. Am I right about that?
No.
Okay,
No.
tell
so,
me.
Somewhat I think currently you are, but going back to
I see. In the utopian future, though, I will not be.
yeah. So going back to kind of the market, I don't think we've kind of heard the end of the story there. I think we've seen user bases shift over time massively between services that seemed kind of unkillable.
Such as?
MySpace.
MySpace failed. I wrote a book about MySpace. I just want to say MySpace failed of its own accord.
Well, partially because it got super creepy.
Well, so the thing was back
Debatable.
then it wasn't really privacy that was the kind of the driver. But as this becomes more and more of an issue, the user bases shift. I mean, to the extent that there's not a market around paying for privacy and willing to pony up, like to the extent that, full disclosure, Google's a client of ours, but to the extent that I voluntarily give my data to Gmail, would I, if I was concerned about that, pay a few, a few brownies a month to have the equivalent service without that? Certainly I would.
And there is no service like that in the market
right, and
currently.
I think that doesn't exist right now, but I think that, so a couple of things there, just to more completely, I think that there's a rise right now in consumer being more cognizant of consumers' desires here. And you mentioned it in the rise of the transparency statement, which is we used to throw up these privacy policies that were just legal-esque documents that no one could parse, right? And now that's just not acceptable anymore in the market. Like people are valuing privacy more, and you're seeing a rise of more plain language on top of that is really forming the basis of consumer trust in your brand. And I think it's a story still to be written, unfortunately.
Well, I'm writing it currently, day by day, so as a journalist covering this. I will tell you this, though, that people are willing to pay for privacy. There is a market right now growing for privacy tools. Mm-hmm. I use almost all of them. I actually added up how much I spent last year on privacy protecting tools, $2,500, okay? So I am the only person in this market, but I am really supporting it.
Wow, how?
How did I do that? Well, I don't use public Wi-Fi, so I have to carry a MiFi around with me. I have a burner phone, so that's a separate phone plan. I have an encryption program on here called Silent Text that's $100 a year. I have a encrypted cloud that's $200 a year. It adds up.
Plus those people that put the bags on your heads when they bring bring guests up.
Plan. No, you still have a data plan with somebody.
You can't
have a data
limit.
plan
Yes, right.
With Verizon or AT&T or who has a direct, we'll say, connection with that large organization known as the NSA.
Right. No. So my that's actually what my point was. So my point is actually I'm spending all this money, and I have I really believe that unfortunately privacy is becoming somewhat of a luxury good. Right. Only people like me who are stupid and pay for this stuff are paying for it. But it's also weirdly kind of a deceptive good, right? Because I'm not actually getting it. So the thing that really bothers me about this market is that as somebody who writes about privacy issues, I sort of want there to be a solution, but I'm also kind of leery. I don't know actually if these encryption programs are really working. I don't have an ability to audit them. And so once again, I come back to, I want to come back to your nutrition label. The truth is you can write that your Fruit Loops have this, you put down the magnesium and whatever, but people know they're bad for you because it says sugar like 500 million grams or whatever. But the food can't kill you. Like, there are safety standards for food. And I kind of feel like if we could get to a baseline, which was like, you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to give this data to your employer, and I'm not going to give it to North Korea, and I'm not going to give it to, just like stuff that we can all agree is bad, right? Then I actually feel like we might be able to then build from there. Like, okay, once we have a baseline, then you can have a nutrition label with the additional benefits.
I don't know. I respectfully, I think you're picking and choosing a little bit, because I think that that hypothetical situation where your Facebook data is going to get shared with a future employer and they're going to find out that you don't have very good work habits is my hypothetical peanut allergy, right? I have to know if there's peanuts in this thing, because if I eat something with peanuts in it, it will kill me. It's not that, so you can do that on either side, right? So I don't think that we're so far off. Let me take that back. We are drastically far away from the level of transparency that a nutrition label offers online. So granted. However, I don't think that it's a situation where starting with the idea of let's just share what the hell was going on in the first place is valueless without a baseline. Because I think that there's such a wide group of people where, one thing that I say it goes back to that concept of there being a business value for your thing and there being a principal value for your thing. The truth of it is that the stuff that you really care about not sharing, like what porn you're watching, nobody cares about, right? Like it's no.
Well, I would say there's people who care.
Okay, but there's not a drastic business. There's not a market maneuver for that.
That is such a good point, because you know what has been happening that's so awesome is the copyright trolls that I just want to say there's an extortion market out there that is legitimately, there's a whole group of lawyers who go out and find people who are downloading porn and then sue them for copyright infringement and get settlements, which are really just like, I'm not going to tell your wife bribes, because they would never win in court, but basically people don't want to deal with it. So, extortion is an important market to discuss.
But fair enough. But I would say that in general, when we're talking about data-driven markets, we're not talking about data-driven extortion, right? We could also get into the way that like criminals use your activity and to actually steal money from you. But I don't think, I think that's a secondary portion of this discussion, right? My point is that the stuff that the average person really cares about keeping private tends to have very little value to businesses that trade data, tends to have little value from what we know about the way that governments do surveillance, right? It tends to be the gap between what we care about and what's actually being used is fairly wide. Now,
I would just point out that NSA documents have several instances of surveilling porn habits. They're super into it.
Sure. Well, okay. But yeah. But the point being, maybe porn was a terrible example. Maybe that's just a rule I should have for panel participation from now on. But the point being that if you care about your privacy, it's almost all on principle, right? Like you have to take a shift at some point and say, I care about this thing because, as Bruce Schneier says, privacy is the thing that protects you even if you're not doing anything you want to keep private, right? And that's that at some point, I'm desperately trying to agree with you, even though I'm doing a terrible job of it, because at some point you have to. Where the market sits right now, you have to have made that shift in your head, right? Where this is something that I care enough about to spend a non-trivial amount of attention on, and in your case, a non-trivial amount of money on, in order to execute it the way that I want it to.
But I think this actually goes back to my entire point, which is that you can't price your data, right? And so, like, I'm putting a really high price on it, you're putting a low price. The truth is, it's somewhere in between a brownie and everything, and we don't know what it is. But I think I think we've created enough like angst that we should open it up so that people can weigh in, because we could fight about this all day, and we do. By the way, all the time.
I want to throw in one thing: is that the market is moving. Notwithstanding what Al Franken is trying to do, and I personally think Al Franken needs to go back to Saturday Night Live.
What is he trying to do, just for the audience?
So Al Franken, as a junior senator, without any authority, pulled a panel together, a hearing this was back in 2011. This is when they found that the iPhone was actually recording your location on the phone. So if somebody stole your phone and got through your password on your phone, was able to actually see where you'd been. And so then they brought them in, they brought Google in, and at the same time, I think there was an app for like police stops and that they were upset at Google about. So Al Franken came and said, hey, I'm going to bring out a law. The law at that time, the law was very, was horribly drafted. And so it went away. So that was 2011. So Al Franken just brought up a new law. He revised it.
These are called bills, by the way. They're not laws yet.
New law, sorry, bills. He's proposing a new law.
Yeah, they're also not going to pass.
They're not going to pass. But again, but in the 3 years where he's basically changed like one paragraph in this bill, there's been amazing strides. And yes, they're slow strides, but this just-in-time notification, you're seeing a lot more now in apps. These prompts in Facebook, you see it on Facebook Nearby, which just came out recently. You see it. It gives you 4 screens telling you what's going on. It tells you where to change the settings. 4 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. These transparency statements. Foursquare has always had a privacy 101, because we knew people would be freaked out because we were location share. So it specifically talks about how we share location. That at the time was one of a kind. Now you see a lot of them, or you see people in the privacy policies, state out things. So there is a progress, to protect consumers.
Right.
That said, is the question. I wonder, is it really to protect consumers or just to make them feel more comfortable in sharing more data? That's the other thing. But there is a progression. There is this progression to better.
We did start at the bottom, so that's
right.
Also
but
true.
I don't necessarily think bringing our Congress into the discussion is necessarily the best idea, because they always seem to be 3 years behind. But.
Should we open it up? Yep. Do we have mics, or just want to yell? I think we'll just yell.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't the risk greater, like companies, say, I'm Australian, so Google, when I search or it serves me ads, it's Google Singapore, for example. Aren't I at risk of, or aren't we all at risk of another government changing its laws? So, you say Foursquare has, we're really clear on how we use our data and where we won't share our data, that another government comes in, passes a law, or the NSA or whatever the government is, whatever the agency is, says, you know what, that's nice that you've said that, we're changing that, we're taking that data, we'll use it. Maybe we get into a situation where, the movie, The Minority Report, becomes reality where there's you talk about porn habits, and we might go, the profile of this serial killer is he watched this porn, this frequency, hey, you're probably going to be a serial killer, we better lock you up now.
I mean, the history of large data sets about populations so in Australia, they were used to target the Aborigines, and in the U.S. to round up Japanese and put them in internment camps. And actually, after 9/11, the census data was taken to map the location of Muslim communities in the U.S. and to surveil them. And this is census data, which is considered like innocuous, completely benign. You fill it out, it's like I'm helping the country, But in fact, population data sets have been abused, and governments abuse them. And so that's why large data sets are concerning, because, NSA, they had thousands of instances of abuse of the data, and they said that all of them were sort of minor and whatever, but we don't know, right? What are they actually doing? And there were definitely cases of people looking up their ex-spouses, et cetera.
But I think is the bigger issue, no matter what data is being collected today, under whatever guise, how it's used tomorrow.
Correct.
Yeah, you're talking.
Totally different.
You raise a couple of really interesting issues. One is the jurisdictional one, which is you're agreeing under some kind of set of laws. Like if I agree to a privacy policy in the U.S., I'm assuming like I can kind of forecast where the U.S. might be going. I'm doing some mental calculation on whether I agree or not. But to the extent that like a government that I had no part in electing, that has a completely different culture than mine, can exert control over my data, it's a huge problem. There's kind of some technical. You're served from Singapore for I think a very good reason, and a number of search engines run into that in the EU as well, right, around filtering out search results, or the EU directive on the right to be kind of forgotten, right? If you've done something horrible at 13, are you still allowed to at 40 have someone be able to Google your name and the city of your birth and come up with some record from some I mean, there is kind of a push in governments to try to do that. The question is, can they exert control over the whole world, right? Just because you can't find it in the EU, you can come to the US, run the same search, and find it. But I think the larger thing is really the permanence of your preference, which is you express a desire for something, and you brought this up as well, which is in the current time, I think you're able to value how much you're willing to give up. But the question is, on a 5-year horizon, on a 10-year horizon, will that be kind of respected? And what if the rules change later? Do I get an option to kind of rethink it and maybe pull out?
And the current regime doesn't allow that. Like, Facebook changes their privacy policy, and I'm sort of supposed to go check it and then basically quit Facebook if I don't like it. Right now, I agreed under a whole different regime, and so that regime itself is, a very I always sort of joke, and I shouldn't say this joke around lawyers because I think it's not true, but I feel like it's an unconscionable contract, right? It's like, this is not the kind of contract you would normally agree to, that the other side can change it at all the time.
Yeah, I would just say that while I definitely understand the sentiment, and I work every day, all day, trying to make that sort of data management more clear to people so that they can begin to make decisions based on that same sentiment, I would say let's be very careful not to confuse data collection and analysis and due process, right? And I cannot tell you how many times I hear that not great adaptation of the source material Minority Report evoked in the course of my day, right? It's constant. We were just joking about it earlier. I was joking about it with the sound guys earlier, like somebody's going to bring up Minority Report, so $5. But the point is that it's the problem in that scenario is not that data leads us to believe that someone is more likely to kill someone than someone else. The problem in that scenario is then we act on that and incarcerate you before you do the crime, right? So we're not affording due process. Now, that's an extreme fictionalized scenario.
Well, there was also the precognitive individuals.
There's also the magic involved, which is something
we need to find those first,
right,
yeah.
Right.
But when we have those, then we'll talk about this.
But even in a real world circumstance like you described, where it's like, well, this is the browsing history of a serial killer. Let's put this person in an institution, right? Like that the step in between there is that due process in action, right? And similarly with the abuses of the census data and all that kind of stuff, even what we're talking about in terms of changing the rules somewhere along the line, there's what you're doing is abusing the process, right? And conversations like this one and actions like we're talking about right now, where we say, hey, as a consumer group, we're very aware of the data that's being shared. We have very serious expectations about how you're going to take care of that data, will inform those processes going forward, right? Because you cannot take that process lightly when you have a vocal majority saying, this is important to us.
More questions? In the back?
So, forgetting the politics of Snowden, on which side that you're on, how do you protect, because he was a temporary worker, he was a contractual worker, there are tens of thousands of these highly trained contractual workers bouncing from companies to companies to companies. How do you protect that data from being taken away and being marketed, whether to a bad party, a country, or large companies? It's not one Snowden, there's tens of thousands of them.
I mean, this happens all the time. There was a rogue employee in Israel who took the entire population database, entire one, put it on a CD, and sold it on the black market. So the entire population of Israel's data has been sold, relatives, social security, whatever the equivalent is there. So this is not unique, right? The data is being stolen, there are breaches all the time, and that's one of the huge challenges of companies like the ones you guys are at, is try to figure out ways to make sure that won't happen, because internal audit processes are actually probably among the most important things that a company can do.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's kind of two things that I see a lot, and I think there's almost two issues packed in there. One is really the kind of the bad actor, right? The engineer who just wants to do something bad. That happens, and they're like standout cases that we all know about. But the more common is the kind of the freewheeling engineer who wants to do something slightly different. I see this all the time. I worked with a client this week where the engineering team wrote their own encryption library from scratch. These are things that have been perfected over time from decades and decades of experience that don't need to be reinvented, and there's really good reasons why they're done this way. And so having standards, I found on the engineering side, can help in the more likely case of a breach, which is there was a hole that someone didn't plug. I don't really know what you can do on the someone comes in and just grabs it. I think that we've been protecting classified data, and apparently in the past we had some mechanism to screen people that were likely to do this. I think possibly that's not being used correctly, but if it's designed to be stored somewhere, it has to be accessed or maintained by someone, and those are the people you got to worry about, I think, right now.
I also would say that like one of the criteria I use when choosing privacy services is zero knowledge. So basically the idea that they don't actually have any ability to see my data. So the cloud that I use, Spider Oak, I have the key to encrypt my data. They can't see it. So like even if somebody there stole it, there would just be a bunch of gobbledygook. And to me, that's the best practice as a consumer. That's what I want, right? I want my data to be encrypted in a way that even if the company screws up, I'm still okay.
There's actually a huge trend moving now. I just mentioned as we were coming in, on my way over, AWS, Amazon's like cloud service, just came out with essentially client-defined encryption keys, right? So previously, if you wanted to use their bulk S3 storage, you had to, they would encrypt it, but it would be like their encryption. So you'd worry, hey, if someone comes knocking or some engineer goes crazy, like, can they steal my stuff? Now they've pushed that down to the user where you can actually define your encryption yourself. And that, I think, not to harp on your market, but I think that's somewhat of the market responding to kind of the rise of this being an issue. It's early days, and who knows if it's going to be enough, but we wouldn't have seen that like a year ago. It was just why.
One thing that companies need to do, and one thing that I think new startup companies don't think about is don't keep everything in one bucket. There's the general startup mentality is, okay, I've got my server, I'll just throw it all there. You need to look at the data you're collecting and understand what the sensitivity of it is, and consider whether or not you should separate out certain data into different buckets. So you could say this is the sensitive information, this is the highly sensitive information, and then you have and the way that networking works and servers work, they can all speak to each other and they can communicate in with very low latency. Latency is always a big killer in the online world, at least. But you can set it up in such a way that when you bring in the contractor, you can say, okay, this contractor is only supposed to see these buckets. And you try to provide, obviously, people are really smart, but you try to provide mechanisms and security within your own services that if somebody gets in somewhere, they can't go everywhere. So fine, okay, maybe they got the email addresses, but they did not get credit card information, or maybe they got first name and address, but they did not get social security. And it's something that people don't think about. People think, hey, I just need to store this stuff and move fast.
Yep.
Yeah,
well, I'm sorry. That goes to being deliberate about what you're collecting, how you're storing it, and what you're using it for, right? We were joking earlier about how so much data collection is not dolphin safe, right? You just throw a net out there and you catch a whole bunch of stuff, and some of it you can use and some of it you don't, but you keep it anyway, right? And that's problematic, particularly when you're trying to respond to a security breach, because if you've got all this information, it's very, very difficult to keep the right amount of attention to it from a security perspective. Like if you're going to revamp, you're going to continue to segment things out and adjust the permissions on who sees what. You have to have a specific set of data in order to be able to efficiently enact those kinds of processes, right? So the old world notion of like, let's just collect as much data as we want, as we can, because maybe one day we'll be able to use it. We have to begin to move away from that as well.
I think we have time for one more question, or if we don't have it, we can keep. Okay, there's a sign in the back, so it's time to wrap up. Okay, so do you want to quickly say one last thing?
That's a common thing that we see on the engineering side, which is early on when you're trying to go really fast, you make kind of compromises in let's just collect everything, we don't have time to sort it out. Yeah. And I think the trick is not to, I don't think you're going to undo that. It's more about as we get bigger as a company and more likely to inflict a lot of damage, we've got to kind of introduce the upgrading of our maintenance into our process.
Thank you guys so much. I want to wrap up with one final thought, which is that what cracks me up about all of this is that, in fact, what's happening is that every one of us is basically having to learn spy techniques, because spies are basically all about compartmentalizing and encrypting everything, right? And like this is actually the world we all live in. Is we do this, have to do this individually, like compartmentalize your Facebook feed is like for your mom, and the Twitter feed is for your profession, whatever. And so we're all in this new world where everyone from the consumer to the business has to do these new techniques.
Yeah, well, in a world where highly trained people were the ones collecting and analyzing data, you could be a highly trained person to prevent that. But in a world where everyone is collecting and analyzing data, everybody has to know how to deal with that.
Right, so basically we all have to learn these skills. And so it's the new digital literacy involves counterintelligence techniques. Thank you all.